Good morning, ex-Winterview. Back again with a brief dialogue for his dear friend, Annastacey. Cold morning, raining, in my car, on the way to work. Need a coffee. But let's continue, nonetheless. This morning's brief dialogue is on objectification. We're gonna mysticize shit up. This is a behavior of mind. We often like to think of the mind as a thinking thing, a thing that thinks. I, however, prefer to look at it more like a creature, a critter, if you will. Not in my control at all, just a forest creature doing its thing. And as a forest creature living its life peacefully in amongst the woods, I can observe its behaviors. This allows me to not over-identify with the content of mind. Take a more objective perspective, you might even say. So, one of the behaviors of the mind, and I'll be covering quite a few of these in brief dialogues to come, is objectification. The process or propensity, getting my P words out, of the mind, can't think of any more P words, to objectify. How does it work? Let us have a look at a brief example using the river. Always a good example. We sit beside a river watching the water pass. Even the word river suggests a single entity. However, in our direct experience, as we look at the river, all we are aware of is moving water. Mind is like a photographic instrument at times. It can snapshot a piece of the appearance and label it, giving it a sense, or giving the individual a sense that that's a solid and real form in the world. So we could look at a section of river and we could label it riverbend, or stretch of water, or this bit of the river, and so on. When you label it this bit of the river, it has a very interesting effect on thought. Thought now, having objectified a chunk of that river, can now manipulate that as an object in thought. For example, I'm sitting at this bit of the river, and after lunch I might walk up to that bit of the river. But I won't go over to that other bit of the river that I was at earlier because that was crap. And so on and so forth. And this is a very helpful ability, you might say, if you needed to describe to a friend or a colleague to meet you somewhere, you could actually pinpoint the location. And of course there's survival adaptation of the species to its environment benefits. So you could say to someone, when you go fishing for the village tonight, you can fish in that bit of the river. You know the bit I'm talking about, near the big tree, and so on. And so there's a very good reason for that skill, you might say. But coming back to the more problematic nature, is that it somehow, in a way, creates this dream, or I don't want to say illusion, it gives the wrong idea that the river might not really exist, but the section of the river as a section does not have an existence outside of thought. This bit of the river is an artifact of thought. It has no independent existence separate from the thought. Losing my words. Bear with me. Need a coffee. So now we know that that's how the principle works. We can now extrapolate and see how that plays out across different domains. You might be painting a door in your house, and a door seemingly is a single unit, a separate object in and of itself, standing alone from the world. But the mind could divide it up. The top half of the door, the bottom half of the door, the side of the door, the edge of the door, this quadrant of the door, this eighth of the door, and so on and so forth. And each, as it's objectified, seems to come to life. It seems to be a real thing. Okay, so that's the basics of the objectification thing that the mind does. The next question is, well, that was fair enough. I was dividing up artifacts that might not have natural divisions, but what about an object that seems to have a natural boundary? It seems to be a single entity. Isn't that an object? Surely. Well, let's go to the good old example of the rock or a pebble. So we put a pebble in our hand and we just stare at it, and there's seemingly something that we could call an object, a discrete object, separate from the hand. It certainly looks different from the hand, and it certainly wasn't there a few minutes ago until I picked it up and put it there, so the mind might report. Now that's all well and good in the world of thought and description, but what about the pure or raw experience of pebble? It doesn't become as clear-cut as we perhaps had hoped when we look at it on a more pedantic or more refined level. So looking at the pebble, looking down in the palm, we could say with utmost sincerity that there's something different from something, as in the skin beneath it looks different from the pebble above it. But without labeling it, without objectifying, it becomes very difficult to separate the boundaries. It's just seemingly two different colours, perhaps. And even now you can see the word colours are creeping in, and of course it's inevitable it will start to objectify. But the raw experience, you might say, even though that's really hard to render down, is of perhaps just a cool, hard firmness somewhere in space, seemingly in front, but again, once you start putting in front and behind, you're back into concepts again. So even when we try and define or claim at least that a pebble is a separate object, it's not necessarily the case. It seems that it only exists once again as a separate object in thought. When I say the pebble in the hand, or in my hand, it sounds all lovely and neat and tidy, doesn't it? It's like, yes, of course it's a separate object, but when we try and explore it in depth, the edges become blurred and fuzzy. This naturally leads me on to the discussion of self, because the objectification quality or propensity of mind adds a massive confusion here to the conceptualization of self. When I say me or I or self, it once again gives a natural, very natural impression that I exist, or I have some kind of independent existence. And second to that, I exist independently from other selves or other objects even in the world. And that's, in everyday conversation, more or less it's fine, who cares? But if we're investigating it on a more, putting it under the microscope, is there such an entity? The raw experience of self is, when I look at it closely, seems to be a conglomeration. Seems to be a reification or an objectification of qualities that, I got a bit distracted there, witnessing almost a car crash, that you can look at separately, break them out of the self, as in break them away from the concept of self and look at them independently, and then the self itself, becomes less certain, less defined. So, for example, what's my actual experience of this me or this I sitting here right now driving? Well, let's start with the basics. I can see a pair of hands in front of me on the steering wheel. I have some vague thought that this is my car. It seems to be the same car from yesterday. So these clues, so to speak, start to build up this or reinforce this pre-existing concept of me or I. There's this feeling that I'm here, existing. I feel like I exist. And that gives a weight to the idea of self. There are thoughts that pop in and out, memories, perhaps flashes of, oh, I've got to do this task today at work. Little ideas that pop in, and it seems to be that it's my task, and the job that it's referring to is my job, and it seems that the person I need to speak to is the same person I spoke to yesterday. It's a beautifully orchestrated, seamless narrative, you might say, all pointing back to the singular entity of self, seemingly, right? But if I drop the concept of self just for a moment and look at it as a cluster of experiences, the self becomes quite fuzzy very quickly. The edges blur mysteriously. So what could I say if I lost the concept of self? Just threw that out the window for the time being. What could I say about my immediate experience? Well, thought pops in, feeling of hand on steering wheel, sense of presence, sense that I exist, awareness of travelling through space and time on my way to work, oncoming traffic, a sense that these are my clothes that I'm wearing, seems to be my face, the familiar feeling of that lip as it moves. Looking at my hand briefly, seems to be, as I just said, my hand. Doesn't seem to be someone else's hand. You'll notice that the experience is forever shifting, forever changing. There's nothing static at all in the experience of the personal experiences, we'll call them. And if we go back to the river example, the river was this ever-shifting, ever-moving entity in front of us, in front of our eyes, that we had stuck a label, this part of the river, giving it a sense of singularity, whereas the actual experience is moving water. So if we come back now to the self, if we look at it as moving water, all those personalized experiences become moving water. In just like the river, they're coming in and out of existence. In and out of existence. Why do they seem personal? I don't know. That's a mystery. Why do they seem to point to a self? Again, a mystery. The why question's unanswerable. It's just the way the world appears. Just how it appears. So this self suddenly is more like a selfing. Like a popping in and out of existence process. It's rather than a self as object, it seems to be a self as process. But once you go down that road, self as process or selfing, you lose the solidity, you lose the objectification. Even though you can label it selfing, giving it a feel that you might know something about this phenomenon, you don't really know that much. It's quite mysterious. And the other thing you notice straight away is that if it's selfing, if it's a process, a personalization process, who's doing that? What is doing that? Because if we've now taken this solid self out of the equation, this me or I, who or what is it behind the scenes, you might say, is causing or creating the selfing? And then it becomes even more peculiar when you really start to think about it. If there's no self and it's just selfing, if we break the objectification of the mind around this person, then how can a process be doing something? So the self could be imagined to be playing golf. I, self, play golf. But suddenly if it's process, all there is golfing. If I thought I was doing my job, I was working, you lose the I, and all there is working. All there is driving. Now again, we concede that those are concepts too, the work, the golf, the driving, and all that. But that's aside the point in this, at least in this example. Suddenly the life that you thought you were living becomes very mysterious very quickly. That lovely solid world that was objectified beautifully earlier this morning, with that self, that singular entity who lived in that world as an object, suddenly it's all gone. It falls away. All there is now is the appearance of an unfolding life. And of course, remembering that relies on concepts as well. And are those concepts, those concepts which seem objectified, what if they're processes too? What if we break the objectification around, like, let's go to, what's that example I used? Work. That's a very monolithic, singular entity, work. But when you are actually engaged in the activity of work, it's many, many processes occurring, popping in and out of existence or experience. The phone is ringing, a person is talking, an email arrives, an email goes, a client arrives for an appointment, conversation is happening, then it's stopping, and so on. And suddenly this hard-edged world from earlier on becomes very fine, very soft-edged, very smooth. Suddenly the tension softens in the body even at that revelation. So the world, and I spoke about this in an earlier dialogue, falls apart. It starts to collapse, not in a literal way, but in the way we think about it. In the way we think about the world, it all starts to break down. And then we lose a sense, perhaps, that there's anyone doing anything. It's all automatic, if you prefer that word. But it doesn't matter. That's trying to explain how the experience works or why it's happening. Those are, you can argue forever, and that's perhaps the realm of science or philosophy, to debate endlessly that. But even those become concepts looked at through this filter, the concept of science, whereas it actually is a process. The concept of philosophy as a monolithic thing is now a process. It's an ing, it's a verb now, whereas it used to be a noun. Now, then we could even go further, deeper into this mystery. I've been using many concepts to describe concepts, but what if I had no words, no language at all to even describe the processes? What could be said then of the world without language? Nothing. You couldn't say a thing without language. That it would just be a total and utter mystery. A total and utter mystery, completely devoid of anything. You wouldn't know what the hell is going on at any given moment. But yet, something would be seemingly going on. And even then I've said too much. Back to a concept, an idea. So if we come all the way back up to the surface, back up to the world of objects, the world of objects seems to make sense. It doesn't seem to affect our life negatively, more or less, but except in one particular domain, and that's self-concept. That can get very nasty for the self. When we start objectifying the self and others, and then we start to label and categorize this concept of self, that can get very unpleasant very quickly. And I work in, as you know, in mental health, and I see it happen day in, day out. The objectification of self with a whole stack of singular, monolithic, immutable concepts about that self, an awful self, a terrible self, a guilty self, and all those awful labels. It's it's rather unpleasant. Let's put it mildly, for the individual who seemingly is doing that. But now back on the level of objects, if we just concede and say, okay, let's just use objective terms to describe stuff, does it matter? No, it doesn't matter. The world still seems to function and unfold in a perfectly natural and normal way. You could even say that the process of objectification is part of the appearance and is totally fine. You don't have to break down objectification. There's no need to. The mind does it naturally and normally. I could go on about this subject, it's fascinating to me, but this is just a brief taster, sample, platter to give the flavour of a world without self, of a world without a background even, a mystery, a total mystery. Wow, I've just mysticized myself out, going into a bit of a satori. Better stop talking before I crash the car. Or who would crash the car? Not me. Haha. Okay. Winterview signing off.